I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to talk to you about Daoist philosophy. Daoist philosophy is one of the 100 schools of thought, known as the 诸子百家in ancient China. The 100 schools of thought, which really stands for many schools and not just 100, flourished through the Spring, Autumn and Warring States period, stretching from the 6th to the 3rd century BC. Daoism remains influential in our times, both as a philosophical tradition and as a religion. Those interested in Daoist philosophy will do well to read the two principal texts of the tradition, the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. The Tao Te Ching is concise but dense. With just about 5,000 words, that is 5,000 Chinese characters, it spells out what one needs to know about Daoist philosophy using an aphoristic style. One can read it in the brief span of an hour or so, but to fully comprehend it and then to truly internalize it may take an entire lifetime. Being aphoristic, any translation is really an interpretation since a literal translation would make no sense. Even readers of Chinese will require interpretation to understand the Tao Te Ching. As with any interpretation, there can be multiple interpretations of the same words, and so reading multiple translations aid understanding. The Zhuangzi is a longer text which expands on the teachings of Daoism with colorful stories, interspersed with brief interludes of exposition. Filled with humor and rather thought-provoking, these little parables will once again take time for its readers to digest and mull over. These two works founded a coherent intellectual and religious movement that is still thriving today. Who are these first Daoists who penned these works? The Tao Te Ching is attributed to Laozi, though his historical existence is disputed. His name literally means the Old Master, while the Zhuangzi is named after its purported author, Zhuangzi. While Zhuangzi's historical existence is not disputed, scholars believe he wrote at most the first 8 chapters of the book named after him. These became known as the inner chapters. Laozi flourished in the 6th century BC, which makes Laozi a contemporary of Kongzi, whose name has become anglicized as Confucius. Zhuangzi lived in the 4th century BC. This timeline seems to suggest that Laozi wrote the Tao Te Ching in reaction to Confucian doctrines, and that Zhuangzi was influenced by Laozi, which led him to elaborate the Tao Te Ching's teachings in the Zhuangzi. However, there are accounts that put Laozi as older than Confucius, and that Zhuangzi was not even aware of the Tao Te Ching. Modern scholarship tells us that both the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi are composite texts written and rewritten over centuries with varied inputs from multiple anonymous writers. Yet those reading the Zhuangzi will find many phrases and ideas that correspond with the Tao Te Ching, at least in its outer and miscellaneous chapters. One theory is that the community of writers of both texts were in contact with each other. Regardless of its complex history, linkages or lack thereof, these two texts form the core of Daoist philosophy. I will focus on just one part of one chapter, chapter 13 of the Zhuangzi, to introduce Daoist philosophy, but with supporting explanations of terms that will draw also from other chapters and the Tao Te Ching. Despite the uncertainty of the authorship of both books, for the sake of clarity, I will refer to the author of the Zhuangzi as Zhuangzi and of the Tao Te Ching as Laozi. Heaven's cause is to circulate without accumulation, and it is thus that all the 10,000 things come to completion, begins chapter 13 of the Zhuangzi. To properly understand this sentence, we need to unpack terms such as heaven and 10,000 things, alongside important concepts in Daoist philosophy such as Tao and Wu Wei. Daoist philosophy, Dao Jia, is based on Wu Wei, or non-purposive action, which is an effortless action. Chinese pronunciation has 4 tones, with some words having just one tone or way of pronunciation, while some have multiple tones. Wei is one of the latter and can be read with 2 different tones, the 2nd and the 4th tone. The 2nd tone, Wei, means to do, to be, to become, to make, while the 4th tone, Wei, means for the sake of. Wu means negation. Hence Wu Wei is translated as non-purposive action. According to Brooke Zippon, the translator of the Zhuangzi text that I am using, What is denied here is not motion or action per se, but the doing of deeds in the sense of consciously taking action for some specific purpose. Chad Hansen, professor of Chinese philosophy, adds another sense. To act without way is to remove the social conceptual character from our behavior and act on natural instinct or intuition. In summary, wu wei means not to act in accordance to some predefined purpose, social expectation, or conceptual norm, but to act according to our nature. The central premise of Daoism is to follow the course or the way of heaven, and all will be well. The idea is that if one follows the way of heaven, things will go the way they should. While the idea of heaven, Tian, has become loaded with religious connotation, that is not the intention in the Zhuangzi. Tian literally means sky and is, according to Zippon's glossary, meant to indicate nature. What is up there above the reach of human beings, where weather comes from, which changes through the seasons, and thus sets the condition for all human activity, but is beyond human manipulation. Tian is the spontaneous and agentless process that brings forth all beings, or a collective name for whatever happens without a specific identifiable agent that makes it happen, and without a pre-existing purpose or will or observable procedure. Such a process of heaven, of nature, is the Tao, which often is translated as the way, though Zippon translated it as the cause. The concept of Tao is what gives Daoism its name. The Tao Te Ching is all about explaining what is the Tao, while the Zhuangzi expands on this, developing the concept of Tao to include what it entails. The Tao that can be trodden is not the enduring and unchanging Tao. The name that can be named is not the enduring and unchanging name. Conceived of as having no name, it is the originator of heaven and earth. Conceived of as having a name, it is the mother of all things. So begins the Tao Te Ching, which literally means the book of the Tao and its virtue. Interestingly, when the two words Tao and Te are used together, Tao Te, it translates as ethics. If ethics is what tells us how to live properly, Daoism does have something important to say. If ethics is what tells us how to live morally, Daoism, at least in its philosophical side, might not be the place to look, since its philosophical teaching seems somewhat amoral. The Tao is not something that can be described completely and sufficiently, and what can be said of it is hence not the Tao. Words are insufficient. Yet just because the Tao cannot be spoken of completely does not mean that we then have no way to learn of it, though just an intellectual understanding of it will be insufficient. The Tao is more than a theory to be comprehended intellectually. There was something undefined and complete, coming into existence before heaven and earth. How still it was and formless, standing alone and undergoing no change, reaching everywhere and in no danger of being exhausted. It may be regarded as the mother of all things. I do not know its name, and I give it the designation of the Tao, writes Lao Tzu. Even before heaven and earth came into being, there was already the Tao. It was already complete. Since it preceded heaven and earth, which is the material realm, it is immaterial. Yet it permeates all things, translated as 10,000 things or 1 wu. Numbers in the Chinese language are similar to the English language, but Chinese does have a unique word to represent 10,000, which is 1. In this context, it is not used literally but figuratively, meaning many things, or as in this case, all things. All things are permeated by the Tao. Humans interact in Tao as fish do in water, says the character of Confucius in chapter 6 of the Zhuangzi. According to Hansen, Tao is a little like the water, an expanse constituting the realm in which humans live, work and play. To be human is to be in a realm of ways to guide us. He explains that Tao as a concept is at the center of Chinese philosophy. The way, being and truth is at the center of Western philosophy. Daoism, when speaking of capital D Tao, is referring to heaven's Tao or heaven's way. But there are many Taos, just as there are many modes to conduct oneself. For example, Confucianism has its own Tao, Mohoism has its own Tao, which according to Taoism differ from heaven's Tao. Even different countries and time periods have different Taos. The use of the term did not begin with Taoism. it is also used in the other Chinese philosophical traditions such as Confucianism and Mohism. Hansen interprets the first line of the Tao Te Ching as, any Tao that can Tao will not be a constant Tao, meaning any Tao that can guide or be used as a guide will not be a constant Tao. Any system which purports to guide people is not the Tao that Laozi is referring to, since such Taos change to adapt to the changing world, while the heavenly Tao is eternal and unchanging. Yet paradoxically, the heavenly Tao is not dogmatic, but is instead flexible, incorporating all the smaller Taos in its plurality. To be unchanging and yet flexible, this must mean that the heavenly Tao itself incorporates such flexibility into its nature. Because of the rather mysterious and paradoxical nature of the Tao, I think that is why the Zhuangzi is for the most part a collection of stories. The Zhuangzi's many tales help illustrate the nature of Tao through parables and stories rather than through discourse and exposition. The Tao is hard to describe, but we can understand its facets and manifestations through stories. These stories are instances and demonstrations of the workings of Tao. In this essay, we mainly examine an exposition from the first segment of chapter 13 so as to directly understand the teaching in a brief condensed form, and then conclude with some of the Zhuangzi's stories. Chapter 13 is entitled Heaven's Cause. Once again, it begins with, Heaven's cause is to circulate without accumulation, and it is thus that all the 10,000 things come to completion. The first sentence talks of heaven, the next about a king, and the last about a sage or a wise person. All three sentences go the same way. Heaven, by simply circulating, will enable everything to come to its fulfillment. A king, by simply circulating, will have his entire empire rally to his side, and a wise person, by simply circulating, will have the entire world submit to them. What does Zhuangzi mean by circulating, particularly circulating without accumulation? Circulating is to be clear-eyed towards heaven, unblocked in sagacity, coursing freely in every direction through all the intrinsic virtuosities of a true king or emperor. He does what he does spontaneously, reads the next line. A person who follows the Tao will be able to develop his inner virtuosities, his natural abilities, and move in the way he would naturally and be successful. What he experiences is never anything but stillness. Yet the sage is not still because he thinks it is good to be still. He is still simply because nothing in the world is sufficient to disrupt his mind, explains Zhuangzi. What does stillness mean? The image painted in the text is one of calmness, of still waters, which is so still that it is like a mirror which reflects back everything in high fidelity. Nothing can disturb the mind of a person who manages to follow his Tao, and because of this great calmness, they can then figure out what to do, how to do it, and go do it. Being at rest, they empty, and once emptied, the actual comes to fill them. To be filled with the actual in this way is to take one's place in relationship with all things, Zhuangzi writes. This emptiness within one's mind is not just a void that remains a void. It is by emptying out oneself that it allows the actual, the true reality, to enter to fill the void. There is a natural order of things, and by being able to empty ourselves, it allows us to then realize how we are connected to everything around us. By knowing how everything is related and how we are related to things, we can then know what to do and how to do it. So once we act in accordance with this knowledge, we will succeed, since we will simply be acting in accordance to the way of things. This is the virtuosity Zhuangzi speaks of. What is virtuosity? The work struck me as odd in Zippon's translation of the word te. This te is the same word as the te in the title of the Tao Te Ching. I had earlier translated it as virtue, which is the root of the word virtuosity. The word that comes to mind when we hear virtuosity is virtuoso, a person who is highly skilled in their craft, like a virtuoso violinist, dancer, craftsman, or bullfighter. When we call such a person a virtuoso, we mean that they are highly skilled, a master at their craft, a person of high attainment in their field. Te here means the same, where a virtuoso, a person with virtuosity, can perform his art effortlessly, possessing a power to give an excellent performance. Zippon explains, If a Tao is a course of study, Te is what is attained by successfully completing that course, the perfected skill thereby acquired, the value gained by doing things that way. Hansen adds, Te links Tao with correct performance. This elegantly blends in the perceived overtones of power in the form of the performer's ability to respond to clues in the context that makes the performance work. The powerful performance achieves the Tao's goal in real time. However, what is this course of study that Taoism is teaching? The Tao of heaven is one which has no purpose, which is non-deliberate, and which yet in this non-deliberateness achieves everything. So a person with virtuosity in the Tao is a person who is one with his nature. Because he is just following his own nature, he can live effortlessly, the way the nature of the organ of the heart is to beat. It beats effortlessly without any conscious thought needed to drive it, the way we continue breathing even when we are unconscious of our breathing. From that point of view, how can one possibly fail? Even when trying not to breathe, we breathe. A person only stops breathing when they deliberately hold their breath. If that person just acts naturally, he will keep breathing. So just acting naturally brings contentment and ease. Worry and sorrow can find no place in those who are content and at ease, and the years of their life are many, Zhuangzi writes. Not only will one who follows the Tao live a long life, it will be a carefree life. In the next paragraph, Zhuangzi raises the promise of Taoism to an even higher pitch, talking about successful kings and people, bringing comfort to the world. Great deeds are done, fame is achieved, and the world is unified. As stillness, it makes one a sage, and as movement, it makes one a king. He seems to be promising success to anyone who follows the Tao, but yet this success does not seem to be one that people can strive for. To strive, to plan, to scheme, to carry out machinations, to engineer one's success will already be acting in opposition to Wu Wei, of just being natural and acting non-purposively. This may seem paradoxical, especially for those of us accustomed to thinking that we need to work hard to get anywhere, that any success needs to be earned, that we reap what we have sown. Daoist philosophy contains several such paradoxes. As already mentioned, Laozi posits that the Tao is not something that can be described, that what is described is necessarily incomplete, unlike the Tao that is complete in itself. But then he goes on to write an entire book, the Tao Te Ching, about it. I'm here doing the same, trying to explain what is supposedly inexplicable. How can that work? How I unravel this paradox is that the Tao is not just something theoretical, such that intellectually understanding it is sufficient. While we first need to be aware of the Tao, and then to intellectually comprehend it by the sense given to it through such works such as the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, we then need to internalize its doctrine of non-purposive action, to incorporate it into our way of life, to truly live it. To clearly understand the intrinsic powers of heaven and earth is to harmonize with heaven, Zhuangzi writes. We need to harmonize with nature, including our own natures, to be in tune and in sync with ourselves. This harmonization is done not for any motivation for profit or even any moral purpose. If you have come to know the music and the joy of heaven, your life is just heaven's own activity, and your death is just the transformation of all things, he writes. Just being, just allowing ourselves to be our true authentic being, will enable us to live in tune with heaven, to seemingly fulfill our destiny, even though there is no predestination, since heaven is a purposeless entity that yet in its purposelessness manages to bring everything to their completion. The Zhuangzi has many exemplars of Taoists whom most would hardly describe as a success. They are more like anti-heroes. Some of them, when asked to take on positions of power and authority by the king, rather commit suicide. Some were bandits, like robber or gangster Zi. Some were simple laborers, butchers, fishermen and farmers, who yet embodied the Tao. Clearly, the success Zhuangzi has in mind is not the success that we moderns or even his contemporaries have in mind, of material prosperity, fame, recognition, title, or even a good reputation and high moral character. Success to Zhuangzi is being in line with the Tao, to just be what oneself naturally is without compromise, since that will lead to contentment and ease, which is after all the aim, isn't it? Non-doing, one simply makes use of whatever the world offers, and still always has more than enough. Doing, one is used by the world and never has enough, he writes. Some may interpret Daoism as a philosophy of quietism where one shrinks from the world, from all responsibility, almost in a cowardly way. I think that is an overly simplistic and hence mistaken reading, since what is advocated is not doing nothing, but of going with the flow, or following one's heart in keeping with one's nature and not bowing instead to striving, societal expectations, or cultural norms. Consider Sun Shu's Ao's story from chapter 21 of the Zhuangzi. Shoulder Self asked Sun Shu Ao, 3 times you were made commanding officer, and yet you did not glory in it. 3 times you were dismissed from your post, but showed no expression of sorrow. At first I had my doubts about you, sir, but now I observe how calmly the breath passes through your nostrils. What special way do you have of applying your mind? Sun Shu Ao said, how can I have anything that exceeds what anyone else has? I just see whatever comes as impossible to refuse, and whatever goes as impossible to retain. I merely looked on those gains and losses as having nothing to do with me, which I suppose was why I looked unworried. How could I have anything that exceeds what anyone else has? I ask, does what matter reside in those external things or in myself? If in those things, it has nothing to do with me. If in myself, it has nothing to do with those things. So now all I do is dawdle at my ease, gazing about me in all directions. What leisure do I have to worry about whether people honour or despise me? Sun Shu Ao was hired and then fired from a high position 3 times. When he was given the position, it did not make him proud, and when he was let go, it did not make him despair either. He maintained a calm state of mind, just going with the flow. He posed an interesting question to his interlocutor. Does what matter reside in external things or in myself? If in those things, it has nothing to do with me. If in myself, it has nothing to do with those things. He understood that what matters is what is within him. Since what counts is what is within him, external prestige from his position of power is irrelevant. He does not shrink from being appointed to the position of authority. He also does not cling to it when he was dismissed from it. He does not refuse to act. Hence the Taoist teaching here is not of quietism and inaction. What he does refuse is to allow himself to be disturbed by these events. However, in keeping with the paradoxical nature of the book, there are other stories in it, which I hinted at above, that shows its Taoist protagonist refusing to go along with things. My own personal takeaway from the Zhuangzi is twofold. The first is rather existentialist. We have to try to understand our own nature and the nature of our society and the world. We have to be true to our own nature, but that does not mean that we always have to obey the Taos of the world. Instead, we need to keep the big picture in mind, akin to the heavenly Tao, which will guide us to know when it is appropriate to just ride along and make use of whatever the world offers, and when to act in accordance with our own inclinations, which may run contrary to the Taos of society or the world. The astute person, the savvy discerning person, is one attuned to the heavenly Tao, and hence knows the appropriate thing to do at the appropriate time and place. He is not dogmatic, not unyielding and inflexible. Instead, he knows when to yield and when to stand firm. In that way, he is the true person, true being what is in line with the heavenly Tao. How to be in line with the Tao, to achieve virtuosity in how we live our lives, requires cultivation and practice. This is my second takeaway from the Zhuangzi, and it is influenced by Georges Bataille's idea of sovereignty and being in the moment, to do things for their own sake. We meet Butcher Ting in chapter 3. He was not born skilled. Instead, he developed his craft of carving meat over time with practice, such that he can encounter the ox with the imponderable spirit of the Tao within himself. His efforts at cultivating his ability makes it a part of his nature, such that he can carve up the ox effortlessly. Wheelwright Flatty, from chapter 13, explains his ability at his craft. In hewing a wheel, if I spin slowly and make the hub too loose, it attaches easily to the crossbar but not firmly. If I spin quickly and make it too tight, I have to struggle to attach it, and it still never gets all the way in. I have to make it not too loose and not too tight, my hand feeling it and my mind constantly responsive to it. I cannot explain this with my mouth, and yet there is a certain knack to the procedure. I cannot even get my own son to grasp it, so even he has no way to learn it from me. Wheelwright Flatty has developed an intuition within himself to know when his work is properly done. It might seem almost contradictory to the concept of Wu Wei to talk about efforts to develop virtuosity. But how then can virtuosity be developed? Perhaps one way to resolve this apparent contradiction is to only seek after things for their own sake, to gain satisfaction from our work, from the work itself, and not say for its monetary rewards. We want to be virtuosos because we want to be the best version of ourselves, to fulfill our Tao, not so that we can be successful in a worldly materialistic sense, but simply to fulfill our natures. By doing what we commit ourselves to doing and doing it well for its own sake gives us contentment and ease, in keeping with the teachings of the Zhuangzi. In keeping with the spirit of Daoist philosophy, I will not implore you to subscribe to the Philosophical Bachelor channel or support it at my Patreon page. You can do so if you are so inclined or otherwise. Just follow your Tao. Whatever the case, I hope you have found this short introduction to Daoism interesting and be encouraged to encounter the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi for yourself. Thank you.